Good evening. My name is Uta Peuger, and I'm the Dean of the College of Social Sciences and Humanities at Northeastern. It's my great pleasure this evening to welcome all of you to the continuation of our racial literacy series. The series has a very broad ambition and is organized under the Presidential Council on Diversity and Inclusion. And I want to welcome all of you on behalf of both myself and James Hackney, who are co-chairing the council, as well as all members of the council. The ambition of the series, as I mentioned, is really one that is quite broad and is very important. The ambition is to detect, to name, and to replace racism. And you will hear quite a bit more about the conceptual work that professors, facilitators, and students have been doing together at Northeastern over the last months, as well as the continuing work that we are starting today. Because in a sense, this event today is both a beginning and a conclusion, and it is at the same time very much a sign of how much the work that we are engaged in here is really work that needs to be ongoing, work of reflection, work of naming injustice, as well as the work of making the world a better place. What we will have an opportunity to do today is really, really exciting and inspiring, I have to say. We'll have an opportunity today to hear from 3 students who, together with facilitators, did a lot of work in the context of the pop-up course that we ran in the fall, a pop-up course that also had 4 public events that you can still find the recordings on the racial literacy website for. And those of you who have not had a chance to see any of those events, I would urge you to perhaps take a look. The audience found with the engagement with the panelists really quite inspiring. We are really excited to hear foremost from our students today, but I am also just so grateful to the curricular leaders, Professors and Doctors Robinson Wood and Cushman, for guiding our conversations today and for guiding a new pop-up. And that is the beginning today, because today also marks the 2nd pop-up beginning. And I'm just so impressed that many students and this time many faculty and staff colleagues have decided to engage on this journey. In fact, I have to say that I'm sorry that not all of you who wanted to join the pop-up as staff and faculty members have been able to join. We could only accommodate right now 60 out of the over 150 of you who wanted to join. But this is an important staff and faculty pilot then as well. And so we will learn from the experiences, and we look forward to offering other opportunities in the future as well. So a special welcome in that context to those of you who are reflecting with our students today, but who are also able to enjoy and engage in the pop-up journey as well. Let me turn over to my colleague in Student Affairs, Dean Bob Jose. This whole pop-up is really under the Presidential Council and also a collaboration in many ways between the academic side and the Student Affairs side. And he will say a few words, and then I'll have the opportunity to thank all of our facilitators, as well as to turn it over to our students and to our curricular leaders. Dean Jose, may I turn over to you, please? You are still muted.
Oh, I apologize. Well, good evening, everyone. And as Dean Porger has said, my name is Bob Jose. I serve as the Dean of Cultural and Spiritual Life here at Northeastern, and I'm very happy to be able to share a few words with you in advance of our reflection this evening. It was a few years ago that I attended a workshop on leadership, and we had a speaker, and the speaker, asked us what we felt was the main aspect or the singular characteristic of leadership. And of course, we went around the room, and to my surprise, we were told that, from this leader anyway, is that she felt that the most important characteristic of leadership was reflection, the capacity to reflect. That caught me a little bit by surprise. wasn't what I was expecting, but as the years have gone by and I've taken the time to think about it, there is not a more important characteristic of somebody who aspires to lead than to take the time to reflect, to take the time to think about where they've been, what their experience have meant to them, and how is it impacting them where they sit now and what's in store for the future. I say this all to you to be reminded that we're going to be hearing the reflections of students who have gone through what many of you who are on the sound of my voice will. I encourage you to listen to what they went through, how it made them feel, and how it impacted their life and for what they will be doing going forward. This topic of racial literacy is the first step in understanding between individuals, between groups. And I hope that tonight is not an ending, but in fact, the beginning to our journey of understanding, to taking the time to understand people and individuals so that we might better communicate and live together in peace. So with that, again, I am so glad that you are all here, and ask you to take the time to listen carefully to what our panelists will say. I have a strange feeling that it's going to impact all of us in a way that we might not have thought of. So again, thank you very much. And Dean Poyger, back to you.
Thank you, Dean Jose, for these powerful words on the ways in which reflection and leadership really intersect. And like you, I so look forward to hearing more from our students today. I want to just take a moment to thank the curricular leaders for the pop-up and the whole racial literacy effort, Dr. Robinson Wood, Dr. Cushman, as well as Drs. Davis, Aljo, and Brunson. And I then want to thank the facilitators of the spring pop-up, Elizabeth Clark, Rachel Moo, Regina Sullivan, Naomi Boas, Alex Kern, and Lee West, as well as Karen Feroza, Ellen Cushman, and Richard Harris, who also guided groups in the fall semester. So again, thanks to you in the audience for being here today. Thank you for engaging in this journey, which is a very important journey and very important work that we need to do together. And without further ado, let me turn over to our moderator for today and the leader of this effort, Dr. Tracy Robinson Wood.
Thank you very much, Dean Poyger. Thank you for your powerful presence on Northeastern's campus. We're delighted to be here. We have 3 fantastic speakers this evening. We pivoted a bit in terms of our order. Our first speaker, she encountered some connectivity issues with her power, but she is nonetheless steadfast and here. So we begin with Michaela James this evening. The floor is yours, Michaela.
Thank you. I apologize again for the power issues. Hello, everyone. I would just like to start off by thanking the organizers of this event and the opportunity to share some of my journey with racial literacy. I like to think of myself as having an advantage in the world of racial literacy. As Anne Campanella once put it, one of the benefits of being bicultural is simply the awareness that how you live is not the only way. Being biracial, I grew up with a heightened awareness of different types of peoples, and I have come to be very proud of having multiple cultures. Looking at me today, you might not be able to tell that I was once too embarrassed to leave my house with my hair in braids like this. I was born to a Black father and a white mother, but I was raised in an all-white family in rural East Tennessee. Growing up, I went to a virtually all-white school, and I was the only person of color in all of my classes. However, the other students could tell that I was different, but they were not exactly sure why. It was just an unspoken something. It was that my hair was too big and poofy, or that I stayed tan during the winter. I knew that I could not change these things, had to be made differently. My mother tried to combat it at first, fixing my hair in braids so it was no longer big and poofy. The children in turn refused to look at me and yelled Medusa every time I would try to talk to someone because my hair looked like snakes. Eventually, I started to just put my hair in a ponytail. The students would then take turns swatting at my hair because it looked like a baseball. Even after several complaints to the teachers, their actions were dismissed as friendly banter and that I was just too sensitive. In the end, I ended up straightening my hair and putting it in a bun every single day so that people would leave my hair alone. I grew up assuming that my experiences were isolated and exclusive to me, that it was just in the cards I had been dealt. It was just a phenomenon of that unspoken something. I had the hope when coming to Northeastern that everything would be different. I naively believed that being in a big city meant that my unspoken something would go away. Unfortunately, this was not the case. I found it very hard to fit into the clubs at Northeastern because they were, if not activity-based, centered around racial and ethnic groupings. I joined a faith-based club that claimed to be welcoming to all types of people. The other members would deliberately exclude me from gatherings, and I just assumed that it was that unspoken thing about me and tried to ignore it. After a few years of this, I decided I had enough and left the club. When speaking to the leader of the club about why I was leaving, the leader said that there was nothing they could do about the members excluding me because they felt uncomfortable around Black people, so they could not expect other students to not feel uncomfortable as well. They blamed cultural differences on why I did not fit into this club. This was the first time there had been a name to my unspoken thing. All of my experiences with race had been social until I was removed from my program because of an administrative mistake. When I attempted to fight it, many of my student rights were broken, and I was met with a series of meetings filled with microaggressions. The meetings left me unsatisfied and unheard. My automatic response was to assume it was just that unspoken something about me, until my white friend found herself in a very similar situation, except her removal was not a mistake on the administrative side. In the end, the university reinstated my friend and even changed her grade so that she would no longer have any problems. Seeing the difference in treatment, I tried even harder to fight, but was ultimately told to forget about it and move on. Since then, I have become a founding member of the Underrepresented in Healthcare Student Leadership Council in the college that I was removed from.
We seem to have lost our connection, Michaela. Well, we have just really been impressed and touched by her moving story. And it's just lovely to see her here and lovely to see her braids and lovely to see her claiming her space and her identity in its many ways. So we're hoping that Michaela can join us. And I hope she knows that we are wishing her quick return back to this important evening. So we will continue with our speaker panel. So at this point, we will call on Lauren Bowe. The floor is yours, Lauren.
Thank you, Dr. Robinson Wood. I'll begin. Hello, everyone. My name is Lauren Bowe, and I'm a fourth-year international affairs major here at Northeastern. I'm excited to be here with you all this evening to continue this important and necessary racial literacy discussion. When I think about racial literacy, I see a path towards a better, more equitable, and more just future that is embedded in empathy for and understanding of one another. If you're here today, you are dedicated to moving forward on this path. This work is difficult and often uncomfortable, and I recognize that each of you is taking steps forward on the individual level to move our community into a brighter future. While I truly believe that racial literacy is our responsibility and not our choice, I'd like to remind you to be kind not only to each other as you navigate through this work, but to yourselves. I should also note that our learning paths will all look different from one another based on our unique experiences. The beauty of this course is that it is a space to not only explore our individual paths, but to also actively listen and to engage with the experiences of others, allowing our learning to overlap and grow together. I was grateful to have been part of this space last semester, and tonight I would like to share a little bit about my origins, my path, and where I am now in this journey. Race has always been a lens through which I view my experiences, my relationships, and my world. As a person of color, I would say it's difficult to escape this lens. This lens is often magnified based on the space I'm in and the labels I'm prescribed. Take the label person of color, for example. At this surface level, I tap into a large community of minority populations that have vastly diverse experiences and many common struggles. When I'm in a room where most people are white, as I often was in the classrooms of my upper middle class hometown, and I've still found myself in throughout college, I usually adopt this label with ease. But just below the surface, I'm an Asian American. This is as much a social and political identity as it is a racial identity. Asian America is my home, my comfort zone, so to speak. In high school, I surrounded myself with other Asian American friends. We were the largest minority group at school, and there was a sense of belonging and community among our group that we couldn't find elsewhere. However, surrounded by these friends, there was also a sense of otherness. Most of these friends had a lighter skin, a single ethnicity, spoke another language besides English, and were first-generation Americans. In this situation, I often felt ashamed that American and Asian American described me better than Asian did. I considered myself whitewashed, out of touch with the culture and the home countries of my ancestors. I clung to my Chinese heritage and all but ignored my Filipino side until I got to Northeastern. If you couldn't already tell from this, one level below being Asian American, I'm half Chinese and half Filipino, though I will amend, as I always do, that these are not exact fractions, and I'll ask that you bear with my math on this. My mother was born and raised by my Chinese immigrant grandmother and my Chinese American grandfather, who was never taught Mandarin by his mother out of fear of racial prejudice, and whose family had been in California since building the first transcontinental railroad in the US. My father was raised by two English-speaking Filipino doctors, and this is where it gets a little complicated. While my paternal grandmother is a light-skinned Filipino descendant of Spanish colonizers, my grandfather is only half Filipino himself. His father was half Black, half white, the son of a freed African slave and a European settler from which I get my last name. Thus, not only am I a Chinese Filipino American, but I'm also mixed race as well. There are additional labels that are my truth: woman, cisgender, able-bodied. Just as my racial and ethnic identity alone cannot capture my full essence, neither can these facets of my identity. The fact is, I am always all of these identities, but I haven't always felt like I could be all of these things at once. When I was Asian, I wasn't Asian enough. When I was Chinese, I was only half. And when I was Filipino, I was even less than that. I didn't even know how to reconcile the other racial identities of my ancestors. I used to debate whether I liked Mulan or Pocahontas more because I was Chinese like Mulan, but I had brown skin like Pocahontas. I will never forget my maternal grandmother looking at me across the dining room table and saying that I don't really look Chinese, when at the time I didn't identify as Filipino at all. Fortunately, throughout the course of my 4 years at Northeastern, I've explored the dynamics of my intersectional identities. This brings me to last semester, where in the discussion sessions, I learned to drop the shame and shed the feeling of being lost in conversations about race. I'm better able to accept my full self and feel confident in my own identity in the space I took up and still occupy in the Asian American community on campus. But I must recognize something I realized in the very last week of this course. I realized that in all of my reflections, I never really considered how my story, the story that I've shared with you tonight, fits into the larger story of the community on campus, of the United States, and of the international stage. I'm not sure I would have reached this point without taking advantage of the dedicated time and discussion space provided by this course. Since this realization and the conclusion of the course last semester, I've continued to put myself in spaces where discussion on racial literacy and learning is ongoing. And I urge everyone here to do the same, not only after this course ends, but during the course as well. Consider the stories that you have yet to hear. The learning is never done. Thank you. And I'll pass the floor to Abby now.
Oh, thank you so much, Lauren. I'm going to just ask that we pivot back to Michaela. She's been able to join us, but Lauren, that was extraordinarily powerful. We're very grateful for your words. Michaela, we're glad to see you back. Thank you for coming. And please resume your lovely remarks.
Thank you. I'm sorry about that.
We understand.
Oh, hi. Can you hear me okay? Just making sure.
Yes, we can hear you just fine.
Perfect. So since then, I have become a founding member of the Underrepresented in Healthcare Student Leadership Council in the college that I was removed from. In the council, I hold two positions where my jobs are to act as a liaison between students and faculty, to aid in the retention of students, and to recruit new university members to combat being underrepresented. While underrepresented is in the name, we do not only welcome this population, we strive to serve everyone. We hold meetings and panels in hopes of bringing attention to healthcare inequities and gaining cultural awareness. While being in this club, I have had the opportunity to meet people with similar experience is not uncommon. Other people have the same experiences, whether it be similar interactions with the administration or even comments about their hair and skin. I have learned to be confident in what is not my differences, but just my characteristics, and am still in the process of learning to love them. For what made them different was simply people being uncomfortable with people that are different from them. The intolerance of cultural difference is part of a larger structural problem that everyone is able to fight against. The racial literacy course enables us to empower ourselves and others in this fight. A large part of racial literacy is unlearning racist ideals and replacing those thoughts. It may be easy to think of this course as a one and done thing, but it is just a stepping stone into a continual lifelong journey. While the situations I have mentioned today don't have the outcome that I had hoped, I learned that the importance lies in that I spoke up. I voiced the wrongdoings and attempted to change them. I stood up for cultural competency and for fighting against oppressive structures. Ultimately, that is what racial literacy is about: detecting, naming, opposing, and replacing racism. At the beginning, it was easy to be discouraged when hearing other people's strides, but I have learned that there is no direct way to racial literacy and that everyone has their own equally important path. To end today, I want to shed light on a situation that serves as an example of how we can continue this journey even after the class. A few days ago, the Sojourner Truth Project was brought to my attention. This organization strives to bring awareness to the historical inconsistencies around Sojourner Truth. In history class, everyone learns about the famous "And I Am Woman" speech. The commonly read version of the speech is highly inaccurate to the speech Truth actually gave. The speech everyone knows was transcribed in a historically inaccurate dialect 12 years after the speech was given. The article, along with which it was published, tells a racially biased and largely inaccurate story about Truth's life. I was very struck when I first learned this because I did not think to question what I had learned in a history textbook. I had to realize that even something I originally took as fact was laced with the historical racially biased structures that we have to continually work to break down. I hope my story serves not to discourage, but to inform and empower y'all on your racial literacy journeys. Thank you.
Michaela, thank you so much. We really appreciate your sharing your lovely story and reflections tonight. And now we move to Abby Stewart. Abby, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. My name is Abby Stewart, and I'm in my third of 5 years here at Northeastern in the nursing program. And I'm from Connecticut as well as San Francisco. First, I just want to thank everyone here for being present and letting me share my experiences with you all. I was thrilled to participate in the racial literacy pop-up course this past fall and was able to gain new insight and knowledge to better help me navigate the social system of race. At the beginning of the course, my biggest struggle was grasping how we can become such different thinkers. I was stuck thinking about how excited I was to participate in racial literacy learning, and at the same time, needing to be aware that some of these conversations were not welcomed elsewhere, and even sometimes amongst some of my dearest loved ones. This question alone helped me reflect on how systems of race have really been present and impactful in my life. First, my babysitter Gladys introducing me to the concept of culture at a really young age by teaching me a new language and showing me her favorite music and foods from her native Venezuela. My broader cultural learning continued when my mom and I moved to Switzerland for a few years, and I was placed in an international school in a homeroom class of 26 students, identifying with 24 different nationalities. And at this school, every person's unique identity was cherished and celebrated. Later in high school in San Francisco, I was more thoroughly exposed to conversations around race. We spent our first year in humanities evaluating culture as a system with our teacher, Aize, through readings, film, and speech. And later on, I began evaluating how, as a white person, privilege has played a role in my life in the class Social Theories of Race and Difference with Mr. Jackson. Here, I grew with my peers in a safe environment to be exploring such reflections and topics. Again, it was here that I began to question how we think the way we do and why we value what we do, as I realized I was not the only one struggling to begin conversations on race with some important people in my life. I think what shocked me about leaving the Bay School of San Francisco was not an adjustment to college or adult life, but that so many other people were having the same conflict of starting a difficult conversation. My journeys continued here at Northeastern. We talked about intersectionality in developmental psychology with Jonathan Hammonds and thought about how it would impact all of our future patients. I engaged in broader conversations around health equity as a Bouvet Fellow with motivated first-year students and Professor Barbara Guthrie by my side. Most recently, reflecting on my own journey of race through this course last fall in my facilitator group with Professor Liz Clark. In such reflections, I also was able to grapple with the conflict of resistance. My goals in ending this course were to start more conversations around race and continue being a listener in these spaces. While I achieved my goal and did begin more conversations as I had hoped, some of them have been truly difficult. And of those difficult conversations, the ones that took the biggest toll on me were those with people who are incredibly important to me. Still, what this pop-up course has emphasized for me is that resistance is fully part of the process. Likely everyone will face some kind of resistance on their individual and collective journeys. I now take away is that I value the differences in every individual journey with race. With different paths and perspectives, everyone participating will get something different out of this course, and that's wonderful. By learning how to reflect critically on my experiences and relationships, I could better understand how my own unique journey has contributed to all of my ideas and values. Strengthening racial literacy is a beneficial experience for everyone, even when our roles in that story can be different. My best piece of advice for those of you who are listening and may identify with these struggles is first, to acknowledge the challenges in your own journey, also to notice what's contributed to your relationship with race, and finally, be excited that this is a room full of people welcoming these conversations. And with that, I will pass it back on to Dr. Robinson Wood. Thank you.
Thank you, Abby. That was wonderful to hear. And I'm so grateful that you participated in the course and that you have all of this wisdom to share with us now. As a people, we struggle with into and remaining into dialogue about racism. The struggle is informed by histories that are delayed, histories that are detailed, histories that are distorted. And affect, emotion, feelings flow from these histories, these untold stories, told stories. And that affect is sadness. It includes fear, shame, resentment, anger, guilt. But there are also other feelings of pride, reclaiming that which was lost, determination of never again, and love. And it is love, and it is hope, and it is optimism that are the fuel of racial literacy. I feel very proud to be part of this beautiful effort with my dear sister friend, Dr. Ellen Cushman and Dean Poiger. So affect refers to the A in the ABCs of racial literacy. And we talked about that in the fall. So by definition, racial literacy detects, names, opposes, and replaces racism and the other isms that are pals, if you will, of racism. So misogyny, xenophobia, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, patriarchy, those isms that are hard to talk about. Racial literacy challenges racism. Racial literacy calls out racism. And it calls out racism's reverence of whiteness. Racial literacy asks, how does my life benefit from racism? Racial literacy interrogates our proximity to racism, identifies whose experiences we have been asleep to and have discounted, uncovers lies that we have inhaled, lifts the drape of white supremacy that keeps us from refusing to know where racism shows up in our conversations, our curricula, our classrooms, our policies, our practices, and in our programs. So racial literacy bears witness to dialogue that transforms and heals by the release of our stories to the light of day. The B in the ABCs of racial literacy refers to behavior. Facing racism is uncomfortable, and we as a people don't like to be uncomfortable, so we avoid it. Racism has been a force in my life, and racism has been a force in your life, irrespective of your melanin content. Do you know how racism has been a force in your life? Racial literacy allows us to acknowledge this force and the cost and the casualties and the consequences. 100 years ago, my grandmother was in the 4th grade. That's meaningful to me because my girls are in the 5th grade. They're 10 years old. They just peeked in. But my grandmother dropped out the 4th grade. My great-grandfather, Mathis Evans, needed her to pick cotton in Georgia. Weren't you mad, my first-generation college-going self? Asked my grandmother. And I remember the look on her face. No, I wasn't mad. Now, in psychology, we call my question to my grandmother of, weren't you mad? We call that a projection because I was the one who was mad, but I didn't own it. My grandmother said, no, my daddy needed my help. He asked me for help, and I helped my daddy. So my grandmother was proud to help her father. So 3 years later, I was in my master's program, and I was conflicted about acceptance into the doctoral program, but not clear as to how to get to where I thought I wanted to be, which wasn't something I was sure about. So I was confused. So I called my grandmother in tears and explained my situation. And she calmly asked, did Harvard give you any money? I said, yes, ma'am. Harvard gave me money. And she calmly said, then you stay at Harvard for your doctorate. I said, Grandma, you You don't understand. I don't want to be here. And she says, oh, yes, I understand. That sometimes you have to do what you don't want to do until you can do better. So go dry your eyes and study. And I love you. So in the deep Jim Crow South, just 5.5 decades after slavery ended, racism yanked my grandmother out of school, as well as countless other people, Black people. That denial and access to education and to livable wages, which we still contend with today for Black people, as well as brown people and indigenous people, Asian people, and white people, defines the racial wealth gap that exists today, which adversely affects the entire economy. My racially literate grandmother illuminated my path. She helped me to read, recast, and resolve racially stressful interactions. And I stayed for my doctorate, and I owe that to her. The C in ABCs of racial literacy is cognition, in terms of our thoughts. And our thoughts in racial literacy say, I do not pretend that racism has not significantly shaped my life, irrespective of melanin content. I know the friends of racism are other isms, and I can recognize them. The cognition in racial literacy says I use my power and my privilege, earned and unearned, to disrupt racism for people across race, not just for people who look like me, but I disrupt racism for humanity, all people. And I benefit from racism when I choose to be silent about it. Racial literacy is not racist. It respects that the reign of racism has fallen on all of the huts, houses, habitats across the land. Racial literacy is invitational, and it says, come, all of us, come to the table, drink from the water together as people. It will bring dissonance, it will bring discomfort, and it will bring development. When exploring the ubiquity of racism, mistakes will be made. Apologize and mean it. Strive to do better. Being shrouded in shame does not help us to move our feet, to replace racism with justice and inclusion and clarity of thought. Show cultural humility. Ask for help. Lend a hand. As Audre Lorde said, your silence will not protect you. Know that in our racial literacy growth, our relationships will change. Our relationships will change with ourselves. It will change with white people. It will change with Black, Indigenous people of color. Racial literacy is empowering. It is liberating, and it extends to other dimensions of the self. It is indeed global citizenship. I thank you for listening, and I'm turning the floor over to Dr. Ellen Cushman.
Thank you so much, Dr. Robinson Wood, for those inspiring words and for your presence here. Thank you, Lauren, Michaela, Abby, for your presence as well. And Dean Pueger and Dean Jose, as always, for your leadership and your guidance in helping to make this all possible. It's been such an honor and a privilege to be teaching and learning alongside our students and alongside Dr. Robinson Wood. And I would like to take a moment to introduce myself a bit more properly to you. Osiyon Naganta, Slowly Dawadoa, Ale Chichalagi, Ageya, Yoneg Dawadoa, Ellen Cushman, Ale Aya Jalagi, Ayehli, Saha'i. Hello, everyone. My Cherokee name is Saloli. I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. I open today with a land acknowledgement to recognize the enduring presence of Indigenous people on this land. We recognize these lands as the traditional homelands of the Mashpee Wampanoag and the Akpana Wampanoag, among many other Indigenous people. The Mashpee Wampanoag tribe of 2,600 enrolled citizens is located on Cape Cod and is also known as the people of the First Light. They have inhabited present-day Massachusetts for more than 12,000 years. We recognize as well the Acknowledgement Wampanoag of tribe of Gay Head, Massachusetts, who received their federal recognition as a tribal nation in 1987. In recognizing these lands as the original homelands of Indigenous people, we acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal from this territory. Perhaps this is the first time you've heard Cherokee spoken, or maybe it's the first time you've thought about whose lands we're standing on today in the Boston, Massachusetts area. I'm pointing here to the imperial wounds, the rain that has fallen on all of our houses, as Dr. Robinson Wood has mentioned. These imperial wounds dehumanize us all, and we need to work together to heal them. Dr. Robinson Wood, Lauren, Abby, and Michaela's racial literacy origin stories demonstrate the lifelong learning and reflection necessary for creating systemic change together. Dr. Wood frames the affective, behavioral, and cognitive dimensions of racial literacy. Lauren detects the machinery of superfacial politics that I've argued elsewhere recreate the difference through a quick glance at our phenotype. She's pretty white looking. How could she be a Native person? Abby does the historical work of naming the dispositions of her family, friends, and peer group that create social stratification, but that also she wants to engage in a very earnest and honest way using her racial literacy. Michaela speaks to the important work of opposing the creation of difference when and where it happens, and establishing a place for yourself to tell your origin stories alongside others. As with all of the speakers at our previous racial literacy events, our students tonight provide the foundation for helping us restructure the tenets of thought that create systems of difference in the first place. For all of us, racial literacy begins with our origin stories. I've been a scholar of everyday literacies, race, and culture for 2 decades, and a scholar of Cherokee literacies and empire for 15 of those years. My scholarship explores the ways individuals and communities use reading and writing to endure and create change. I'm a literacy scholar. My first book, The Struggle and the Tools, explored the reading and writing practices adults use daily to secure resources from social service agencies, to find housing after evictions, to supply their families with food, heat, and clothes, to seek education, and to navigate the criminal justice system. And what I learned from them was that their literacy evidenced an ability to detect, name, and oppose. And it was something they learned in their family. And they were detecting, naming, and opposing the institutional bias and racism that permeated their everyday lives. But no matter how strongly community members believed that their struggle and their tools would eventually gain them modicum of resources or respect or social change in their circumstances, it would never produce that systemic change. Audre Lorde reminds us, the master's tool will never dismantle the master's house. Systemic change requires of us all the hard work of detecting and naming the fears that lead us to recreate difference. Systemic change requires of us all the hard work of opposing injustice when and where we see it. Systemic change requires of us all the work of replacing the predispositions we may have to maintain a very comfortable status quo. That work of replacing begins with recuperative and restorative projects. That's what that work Indigenous scholars call epistemic recovery. Now, I was raised knowing I was Cherokee. There was a Cherokee syllabary chart in my home, and I knew how to pronounce each one of the characters. But I also knew that growing up away from my nation, which is in Oklahoma, Tahlequah, Oklahoma, I grew up in upstate New York. I knew that even with citizenship with my peoples, if my peoples do not claim me, I should not be claiming to be a Cherokee person. In 2005, I enrolled in online Cherokee language classes, and I began visiting Tahlequah more routinely. Slowly and surely, my connections to my people developed, and my understanding of the language grew just a little bit. In my second book, The Cherokee Syllabary, I traced the influence of the 86 character writing system invented by Sequoyah and adopted into widespread use by the Cherokee people in the 1820s. Thousands of Cherokee texts penned in the syllabary, including church records, remembrances, speeches, letters, and government's documents. They exist everywhere in archives around the country. And these are the everyday records of Cherokee civic thought and practice in the face of sweeping social change and outright oppression of our Indigenous ways. Those records hold tremendous knowledge, new words, and the potential to sustain the learning and use of Cherokee language. So since I've been here at Northeastern, I joined our faculty in 2015. I'm really proud to be here. I've been building a team of Cherokee speakers, learners, teachers, and translators, linguists and librarians and scholars, all of us dedicated to learning more about what these documents say. We together are dedicated to that epistemic recovery work possible in and through Cherokee language documentation and revitalization. In your chat, you're going to be seeing a link posted, and I'm inviting you to please visit the beginnings of our work of the Digital Archive for American Indian Languages Preservation and Perseverance. This is an archiving space suitable for supporting the collective translation and display of American Indian language manuscripts to advance Indigenous language learning and documentation. I've been very grateful to Northeastern for supporting this work through a Tier 1 grant, through several Peak Awards supporting my undergraduate research assistants, through IMLS, and most recently today, as of 2 hours ago, the Luce Foundation, who has supported this work so generously. Ultimately, this digital archive, I hope, will create a place that can serve as a model for all Indigenous people to provide this robust manner of collective translation to forward the goals of our language perseverance and preservation. The collective action of building this team and developing this team, the collective work of racial literacies, all of that collective work is necessary to recreate, to make possible the systemic change that helps us replace suppressed epistemologies that can enact our systemic change that we hope to see. Our collective work begins with each one of us tonight, reflecting on our own origin stories and our dispositions to think, feel, and act. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you for joining our collective journey of detecting, naming, opposing, and replacing systemic racism. Saloli dawa dawa, chichalagi ageya, shiwani sani. My name is Saloli. I'm a Cherokee woman. I have spoken. Wado, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Cushman. Your words settle over me. Just amazing to listen to you. So thank you. Epistemic recovery, beautifully said. And this is what we've been talking about, I think, tonight is recovery. Recovery of our Native origin stories, of those things that have been cut off, taken away, hidden. And in that bravery and that courage, we claim and tell what is ours. And that's a good thing. So this is a chance for us to receive questions from our audience, but also for us to talk with each other. And I'd like to start us off, and we encourage audience to share questions in the chat. But I would like each of the student panelists to, and in some ways you already did this, but to reflect on your interactions with your facilitator. You did that already, Abby, when you talked about your facilitator being Liz Clark. But how did those interactions in the pop-up course with the facilitator as well as with the other students influence your thought processes as well as the emotions that you had regarding becoming more racially literate and racially aware? Could you start us off with that, Lauren?
Yes, of course. A huge shout out to my facilitator, Director Lee West. Director West actually posed a challenge for me in my reflections. From the very beginning, he asked, what is my role? What is your role in creating a racially just world? And at the beginning, I thought, well, I have to identify who I am and where I am in order to identify my role. And once I did that, I sort of realized that I needed to not only consider myself when considering my role, but I had to consider everyone else and how I can elevate and lift and hear people's stories in doing so. And I think that was a big takeaway for me from the course last semester.
Thank you so much for reflecting on that, Lauren, with regards to Lee's, Mr. West's leadership there for that thought process as to what role do you play in creating a more racially just environment. Michaela, what would you say with regards to that question?
So I had Director Kern as my facilitator, and he was wonderful. He actually helped me in my process of with the clubs and the administration. He provided support and resources in order to connect to the right people. And he also encouraged me through my reflections to not only break down my barriers, but think about the way that I had been raised and the people and the thoughts that they had as well.
Very nice. Thank you so much, Michaela. Abby.
Hi, yes. In my group with Liz Clark, I think the biggest takeaway was we were provided a safe space to all kind of go on our own individual journeys, but then share our reflections collectively, learning from our peers. And as someone in the chat just mentioned, we were really able to lean in to this process, whether it meant we were facing resistance or not. And I think that was incredibly valuable.
Absolutely. I really am impressed, Abby, with what you were saying about that there were spaces where the people that you loved dearly and cared for deeply, who had a hard time having conversations about the material that perhaps you were discussing in the pop-up. I'm interested in knowing, how do you navigate that difficult kind of territory in terms of people's sometimes subtle but can be overt resistance to hearing about some aspects of your own growth and in terms of racial justice that it's hard for them to hear. How do you stand in that space?
I think I try to be the best ally and the best listener that I can be as a white person, and recognizing that privilege I have to be able to hopefully be a productive ally. That's where I come from when I enter those conversations. But it's also important to recognize, the different journeys people have been on to get to where they are, and why, okay, this is why I think the way I do, but why might someone else think the way that they do? And I think one thing I did take really from my high school was learning how to talk to people that might really not think the way that you do and have productive conversations that, are not tense, are civil and respectful of both sides and everyone's own values. And I think those kind of pillars of respect are really the only way you can calmly and efficiently navigate these conversations. So while, I've had a hard time and I've had people who wouldn't want to listen to what I had to say, I need to respect that, but also move on in creating more new conversations with more people, if that makes sense.
No, it does indeed. Michaela, I think you were the one who started us off with saying that the way you live is not the only way to live. Was that you who quoted that beautiful, who was it that said that? That was such powerful words.
Yes, it was Amy Campanella. She's an author.
Okay. Have you had challenges with having conversations with people from the information from the pop-up, and how have you learned how to contend with that those difficult conversations?
So I definitely have had very interesting experiences. And I think one thing that I had to learn was to have grace and to not expect people to understand right away, and really give them time and space to reflect and let them have their own journey, and not try to force them to be in my box journey as well.
So I love that word, grace. It sounds like you offer such patience and kindness to people, and respecting where people are and where they're not. Lauren, did you want to add to the conversation regarding challenges with giving voice to calling out isms and how that can be challenging for some people to actually hear and
Yes,
receive?
completely.
How have you dealt with that?
Well, echoing Abby and Michaela, I totally agree that sometimes these conversations, when you're having them, it can get tense regardless of how patient you are, etc. But it's in knowing that the conversation's not over, and leaving space for continued conversation, I think, is something that I've had to remember. Even just recently, when I was coming back up to Boston, I'd been talking with my dad, and he made a comment that was, it was racist, and I had to identify that and calmly try and explain why that was the case. And even though he didn't I don't think he understood still after that conversation. I know that that's something that's still ongoing, and that's a conversation that we can go back to, rather than shutting that down and viewing that as, oh, he'll never understand. So I think that is something to remember as you engage with your family members and other people close to you, is that these people aren't going away from your life. So yes.
Such lovely wisdom. There's a saying, every goodbye ain't gone, and so I love what you were saying, Lauren, about, the conversation isn't over, and sometimes there's a pause, and there's a dedication to return, but maybe at a better time, but not necessarily at that present time. Dr. Cushman, you were a facilitator in last semester, and I wonder how you found to deal with these conversations that can be challenging for people to hear, and they're part of our inner circle, and we value them, and yet there can be that impasse for them to hear what it is that we are uncovering in our own lives. How have you negotiated that?
Thank you for asking, Tracy. I was really very fortunate to have such a strong group of students. There are always wonderful students here at Northeastern, as our panel amply demonstrates. And one of the things that I was so impressed with in our students were their ability to tolerate the kind of discomfort as they were grappling with thinking about how they were going to deal with difficult conversations with their family. This was, over fall, so they were looking forward or getting ready to the Thanksgiving break and trying to think about how they would deal with those conversations. and how they really wanted to begin to sit with that discomfort and understand where it was coming from and help their family members understand where it was coming from. I think too, one of the things the students taught me was how willing they were to name the fears that they or their family members might be having, and where it is those fears actually come from. Because once we get to the root of that, we begin to really understand whether or not those are realistic fears. I think finally the other thing that I learned from my students, and they were so wonderful with this, was that they were very, very good listeners, and they were okay just being silent and hearing somebody go through and try to unburden their entire story, and then reflect it back. And they saw story as in the end a kind of way of creating and maintaining a social obligation to each other, and that to me was really very powerful.
Thank you so much. That's beautifully said. We have a few questions in the chat. To the student speakers, how do you think you have been able to utilize the experience and knowledge you gained in the course in your interactions with others in your everyday life? Anybody like to start off answering? That's a great question. Thank you for Brianna, who asked that. Any of you would like to respond?
I could start.
I'll start with you, Abby.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sure, Lauren. Thank you. No, go
I
ahead.
apologize. Yes, thank you, Brianna, for that for the question. And I think this echoes back to what I was saying just a moment ago about my conversation with my dad just over a month ago now. It wasn't even that long ago. And in that experience, my dad had actually been talking about economics. And so it seemed unrelated at first to any conversation around race, but as many of us know, it's hard to disconnect our conversations around race with our conversations around economics, capitalism in this country, as well as other processes and institutionalized processes, especially in this nation and around the world. And it quickly devolved into something that was clearly more racially motivated than I had originally thought it would be. And rather than brushed off like I had been wont to do in the past, I think I was able to at least be more confident in responding to my father and to, calling out why I thought it was racist. Even if I didn't have all the answers, I'm by no means an expert in economics. I think that it's important to at least name things and recognize it for yourself. And that's something that I've learned coming out of the course and have been able to utilize, not just in that one occasion, but on multiple occasions since the course ended.
Wow, thank you so much, Lauren. Abby?
Hi, I actually would have a pretty similar example. So I totally agree with everything Lauren has said, but to throw a different example in, I'm again a nursing student and I'm currently on co-op in the lovely Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. And I work in a NICU, which is a neonatal ICU. So I work with babies. And I think in any healthcare field, I've become more aware of, health inequity. And I think something I've taken away that I bring into my daily life is checking biases. Because our patients can't talk to us. There's a lot of parent or guardian involvement. And I think, what Lauren was just saying about naming things is really important. So not only have I been, checking my own biases when I walk into a room with a new family, but also, noticing where they might exist in other areas. Maybe it's in, other patients I'm not working with, but noticing a certain attitude or a certain way that another coworker might be walking into that room that might differ based on, what race someone is. So yeah, I'd say for me, definitely checking biases and naming them with open communication.
Sounds like you don't run away from them, but there's a acknowledgement exists. So I hear that. Thank you so much. Michaela, did you want to respond to the question of how you utilize the experience of the pop-up in your everyday life?
Sure. I definitely am going to echo both what Abby and Lauren were saying. I think having the confidence to, in my experience at least, to stand up for myself health-wise has really changed since I took the course, and really advocating for myself when I go to the doctors and see if they have like these different biases and things like that.
Very nice. Another question had to do with how we rejuvenate our souls, given the nature of this work, and how in terms of our individual journeys. Dr. Cushman, may I ask you that question, please? Can you start us off?
Sure, I would be happy to. So there are several ways in which I do that, but one of the primary ways in which I do that is to connect back with my people, and to just go to a creek with them, go to ceremony with them, but mostly during the week, especially, I take care to make sure that I take a lot of walks. Just get outside and clear my head, and also try very typical kinds of things that one does for self-care. Get up and walk around, make sure that I'm getting enough water, make sure that I'm eating well, taking care of myself, getting rest, because really all of it has to start with us. We carry so many burdens, all of us, and help so many people in our lives that if we're not taking care of ourselves, we're not in any position to help others. So it's really very important. I wish I had a more profound answer for you, but really I don't. That's it.
Self-care is very profound, so I thank you for that. Did anyone else want to respond to how they engage in rejuvenation of the soul in our individual journeys?
Yeah, I can speak to that. On top of self-care, I've also found that journaling and writing down my thoughts can be very helpful and just lethargic on being able to rejuvenate myself as well.
Very nice. Journaling is critical. It's a way to express and to release and to tell those stories that need to be told. Lauren, Abby, any responses to rejuvenation of the soul?
Yeah, so I can go next. One thing that I found to be very powerful in my experience is this idea of mutual aid, and how we're living as, we might consider ourselves individuals, and I think we consider our society pretty individualistic, but we are a community, and I think there are a lot of communities on campus and in Boston that are looking to support each other in these conversations. And I personally feel very fortunate to be surrounded by friends who are really supportive, and also engaging in similar conversations, in, not necessarily in the same space as me, but when we come together, I know that I can feel confident that even if I have fears, I suppose, as Dr. Cushman had brought up earlier, I feel safe in saying my thoughts. And if I do say something that maybe isn't correct or has some biases in it, I know that the people who I surround myself are looking out for me, and they are making sure that I'm staying on the right track. So I think the idea of mutual aid and of finding your community and really utilizing their support is one way to stay rejuvenated throughout the process.
So key. I mean, the community is powerful and critical. This work can be challenging. It is challenging if done well. And if you do it in isolation, you will burn out. So it's important to be refueled by caring communities. We have a question. The person says, oftentimes we work on developing self to manage our individual experience. Can you speak to what you see as your role as the bystander in managing a racist situation in our NU community? So it sounds like the question is asking, the questioner is asking us, so if you see an act of racism, what is your role in terms of giving voice to that? Has there been a time when you've had to do that? I think it's a beautiful question. And I know that even some schools with elementary and middle school kids will certainly talk about the role of the bystander and how to perhaps intervene in a way that can be safe, and get allies involved so that you're not dealing with situations on your own. But any comments regarding at NU, Northeastern University, what can be done if you are maybe in a classroom or a residence hall and you see an act of racism?
I can start.
Go ahead, Michaela.
Okay. So I definitely think being an ally is like first and foremost. I think depending on the situation, either helping empower the person so that they can speak up for themselves, or if they are not comfortable being the person speaking up, I think it definitely depends on the person in that situation and their comfortability levels. But I definitely think at least addressing the situation and making sure that something is done, regardless of how it is done, is the most important thing.
Thank you, Michaela. Yeah, I think it's in these situations we want tools in terms of what can be done, who can you go to assist, so that safety is certainly there, because oftentimes people may not say anything because they don't know what to say, or even like professors might be in a classroom situation where they hear a statement from a student that might be seen as racist, and they don't know what to do, or they don't know how to use it as a teachable moment, or even attend to certain students in the classroom who may feel overtly targeted. And so there are opportunities, and that's what we want. We want to provide faculty as well as staff with, if this is all of our concern, not just certain bodies based on melanin content, but this is an issue of urgency for all of us in terms of how to respond. And it can be done in a way where you give voice to it, in a way that is clear, but it doesn't have to be aggressive. And sometimes we confuse the two, because something can be said firmly, with clarity, but it doesn't have to be draped in meanness, but it is a response to that. This kind of language doesn't create a safe place. This is not acceptable. There are different ways to reframe this, and to also educate, because sometimes people may not be aware that the comment had some real proximity to racism or felt alienating. So oftentimes education can be very insightful in terms of, well, one way to look at this is this, or even to provide some data or facts, research in terms of there's another way to look at this, and it's not as narrow the ways perhaps as you've understood it. So that can be very helpful to see it from that perspective. At 6:19, and let me just, I'll ask one more question. Oh, yes, Dr. Cushman.
Oh, I just wanted to I just wanted to add very quickly, Tracy, if as we're thinking about the ways in which we work with bystanders, I think also giving the benefit of the doubt and trying to explain from the perspective of the person who had to absorb that, because sometimes these things are very insidious, and people may not know that their behaviors have had that impact. So giving them the benefit of the doubt, explaining how it had that impact, how it was received, and asking them to think about it and think about how they might act differently and what their next steps are. I think you're absolutely right, are all really helpful and very, very helpful indeed. Thank you.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And then that sounds like grace, Dr. Cushman, in terms of understanding that people are coming from a frame and a perspective in which they've been socialized or conditioned in, and may not have access to other ways of thinking. So let me just ask this one question, and then that will be all that we're able to do. Often I've had interactions with older individuals who say racist things, and others try to make an excuse on their behalf that they grew up in a different time. What is the best way to approach these conversations, especially if they are someone I am close with? And I think we've already been able to, fortunately, talk about that this evening. Lauren, you beautifully said, you referred to a conversation you had with your father. Something was said that you thought was racist, and you realized that this conversation can continue, and this isn't all that there is, and so there's more opportunities in the future to educate or to provide insight or to continue the dialogue. And you talked, Abby, too, about people who you're very close with, who are part of your inner circle and who may say things that they're not mindful of. And it's hard for you to hear, and yet you are certainly able to love them and not cancel them, but certainly be in relationship. I didn't know if there was anything more you wanted to say about that. I think it's a powerful point with respect to this person's question, referencing people who may have grown up in a different time.
I would just love to add, I think these conversations are difficult. You don't really know what to expect from them, and that's okay. And acknowledging that to yourself and just pat yourself on the back for even going to begin these conversations is amazing and incredible, and give yourself some love for that. And just be honest, and that's really the best you can do. And I think that's what's important.
Absolutely. And there's so much reading material. I mean, people are writing so much. I mean, across race, people are writing about their experiences. That's the power of racial literacy, telling these stories. And so oftentimes share a book with the person, share an article, a podcast, a movie, a film, offer to watch it with them, because join with people, because people just simply may not know. I spoke to a woman not too long ago, and she had read a book by Robin DiAngelo, White Fragility, and she said it gave her a new pair of glasses, right? A different way to see the world. So oftentimes that's what's needed in order for people to think differently, which will lead to feeling differently and behaving differently. That's the ABC arc of racial literacy. A question has come up, though, as if it's possible for us to point the students and faculty and staff to where they can find the next Zoom meeting for the class to follow at 7. I'm going to defer to you, Dr. Cushman. Do you have an answer for that?
I do. I'd be happy to give that very quick pointer. So you're going to log into Canvas, and when you do, you are going to go to the people pages, look up your group assignment by clicking on the Groups tab, find out who your group facilitator is, then hop back out, go to your facilitators folder, and there you will see all of the Zoom links for the class. So it's a few moves there to get back to it, but you'll find your way, and we're looking forward to seeing you there.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Dr. Cushman. There's so many comments in the chat thanking everyone for your words, your stories, your wisdom, how inspiring it has been. I find myself thinking that when I was in college, I didn't have a racial literacy pop-up, and I find myself thinking, what might that have meant? Because I certainly needed one. So I just want to thank you for your bravery and your courage to speak. Because sometimes in the remembering, which I think is so vital, it can recall, we have memories that can sometimes land in a difficult way on us, as we reflect on certain ways in which we were treated, where people didn't have enlightenment or said things, and children can oftentimes not understand it, and it can feel like people are being treated very unfairly. And so I appreciate your taking the time to honor memory and then to share that, because I do believe it's in the sharing that can lighten some of that load and usher in some real important healing. I do believe that we are out of time. I want to thank you so much. It's been a real privilege to be on this panel with each of you. You helped me to feel life is bigger and bolder, and I thank you for giving me that push and the wind behind my back, for being such an inspiration. This certainly represents for me at Northeastern a highlight of my 19 years since I've been here. So I want to thank you for that gift that you have offered me. So thank you, panelists and audience. Thank you for being here. I see that we had 150 people on this call. Thank you, interpreters, for making this open and available to people. And we are just grateful that you have been with us. Looking forward to hearing how students and faculty and staff will be part of the racial literacy pop-up this semester. So we're excited, as well as our students. So please know that this information can be found on the racial literacy website. And so thank you very much. And we wish you a lovely, lovely evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.